I brought my tech objections about what Nintendo was doing to some tech employees from Intel tonight because I play Dungeons and Dragons with some locals, and the guys I play with, there are some Intel employees, and so I started asking them some technical questions about this one because, like I said, I mean, there are alarming implications of what Nintendo said. The reply I got was that it was incredulous and very unlikely that Nintendo would use packet injection to do this. They would simply cut them off at the source. And I thought about that for a second, and I realized that what they were talking about was closing somebody's Nintendo account because the person did not engage in the Yulia, and to them that would make the console worthless. But I thought about that for a minute, and I thought to myself, I mean, well, for resale purposes, but as far as I'm concerned, if somebody had done this to their system and their Nintendo account was closed out and they tried to sell that on eBay, I would just want them to note that was the reality, and I would probably actually buy that over other Switches because I individually don't play the kinds of games that I really have much of a use for multiplayer for. I mean, I prefer very solo turn-based RPGs over pretty much everything else. I do play Dungeons and Dragons, obviously, with some locals, but it just don't. I don't really engage in this kind of thing with a group, and yeah, so you know, it just they pointed this out. They pointed this objection out to the whole thing, and I thought they might have a point, but if we look at what Nintendo was threatening in this whole thing, I mean, the the Yuya in this basically, Nintendo changed its online user agreement in multiple consumer unfriendly ways. So the whole thing basically says that if threats to so basically it says they've included threats to brick the customers' consoles if they fail to agree to the new Yulias after the console has been purchased. This is there are some objections to this, which is number one, just because you have it in your Yulia doesn't necessarily mean it abides by the restrictions and rules that Yulias have to apply to. Basically, you can put whatever you want in there, but that doesn't necessarily make it legally enforceable. And the consumer may still have the right to proceed against Nintendo in a lawsuit if they were to use this ability in any way, shape, or form. And again, this assumes as well that Nintendo was the one to send it. If it's used by a third party, they can also be potentially sued for this being there in the first place because they failed to properly secure their systems and do the due diligence to prevent hackers from using this ability or backdoor and piggybacking off their own systems to do it, which would be legally irresponsible. But I want you to consider that if they are injecting packets in any way, shape, or form to get this done, rather than just closing people's Nintendo accounts, number one, it doesn't matter if they close certain people's accounts because we're only going to use them to play offline games. The second problem is that IP address that those packets would come from. If they do build a whitelist in it, that's going to have to be represented in the code, and that would be hard coded into the system. And the moment somebody's able to dump the firmware, which will eventually happen, and in fact Nintendo may distribute this firmware themselves, somebody's going to be combing over that code, on the other end, and have that thought, and that those IP addresses are going to leak at some point that are in the whitelist, and at that point, somebody can build an access control set list for their firewall, so that all incoming packets from those IP addresses simply get dumped in the bit bucket, which is a fancy way for those that are technically inclined to say, this data has come in, but rather than redirect it to the MAC address of the machine that the packet was designated for, I would like this firewall to simply delete the data that was sent and just, you know, basically zero fill it, that the stuff that came from this IP address, don't forward it on, just dump it in, the bit bucket of the router, and, delete it rather than forwarding it on if it comes from this IP address as a rule that's baked into their firewalls, as well as DNS sinkhole it, because, as people were saying, it's likely that they would trigger the system to, remotely download a bricked version of Nintendo's firmware from a remote server. But again, that won't matter if you're using a DNS sinkhole to block that server. So you can block it on both ends if they use that approach. So you can make it ignore the packets coming from that, and use a DNS sinkhole so that, the web domain that that update came from would never resolve in the first place. But, the user agreement, Nintendo asserts the right to render your console permanently unusable if it determines you're in violation of the agreement. And the open question here is what is meant by permanently unusable, because, if they mean the console itself, again, that you can put whatever you want in your Yulia, but that doesn't mean that that's necessarily legally informable, you know. And this specific phrasing is distinct from the Yulia in 2001. You acknowledge that if you fail to comply with foregoing restrictions, Nintendo may render Nintendo account services and the applicable Nintendo device, permanently unusable in whole or in part. And this means what they were doing was closing people's Nintendo accounts, but that just means that you would not be able to use, online services with Nintendo. You wouldn't be able to share your achievements with other gamers and that other thing. And but not every gamer necessarily cares about that, you know. So if they retain the ability to remotely disable the device that we bought, even if it was for circumventing anti-piracy protection and pirating its games, you know, this is not, you know, particularly relevant to the objection at hand. The problem with all of this is if the company develops the ability to remotely disable a person's Switch, how are they going to do it? I mean, if it's being done as, would be implied here to do more than simply disable somebody's account services, which if you're experienced, that that's very distinct. That just means that you can't use, the online service effects. But, for one thing, if you're experienced in that area, like all the updates to the games, even if they build in code that won't build anything, but that won't boot anything but the latest version, that's number one. There are tools to get around that, and number two, the updates all leak to sites like Torrent Leech, so we get them anyways eventually, 90% of the time. And that last 10%, there usually is a way to hack their way around it. And so if they're just closing out Nintendo's account services, well, that's being done on Nintendo's servers. But if we read what they're saying and the way that it's phrased in this Yulia, you know the the open inquiry is, what are they going to do this? I mean, is there going to be a packet that's sent towards people's Nintendo Switches that tells them to download an update that bricks people's systems. And if that's the case, what stops somebody from deliberately going out and capturing that packet and then building a Python script to essentially replay that packet but target it at a different IP address in somebody else's switch, and then, if that were to happen, if they have not built in, access controls that would only accept those inputs from specific IP addresses, then you've got another problem, which is essentially Nintendo has opened itself up to a class action lawsuit when, people that are not Nintendo, reverse engineer how this packet and capture it themselves and start exploiting it to brick innocent people's switches all over the place who had in no way violated Nintendo's Yulia, which could be done almost trivially with the request library with Python, and very, very easily. And, ChatGPT, for all the things that it does to prevent people from doing something like this, is not particularly intelligent at, spotting this before it basically spits out the code, depending on how clever you are in phrasing, what you're trying to do to the to Chat GPT. And so, there are whole libraries that could be used to reuse this packet against some innocent victim, and inject this packet yourself at somebody's switch. If they do, though, as I said, go about and they are going down the packet injection route, but they build in security that only accepts those inputs from certain IP addresses. Well, we've got another problem in that, eventually those IP addresses will become public knowledge that are part of that whitelist, because again, you're going to be putting the bank vault in people's homes, and eventually people, the bank robbers are going to, in this analogy, are going to find those IP addresses that are in the whitelist, and then it's a relatively trivial matter to, build a rule into your firewall that tell it, like as I said, to redirect any incoming packets from that IP address not onto their designation that is put inside the encapsulated data packet, to strip out the MAC address that it was supposed to go to, and then just delete the data rather than forwarding it on to its potential destination. Also, if, as was covered in the comments section, this packet is to trigger them to download a file from a remote Nintendo server that bricks their consoles. Well, if you've ever heard of DNS sinkholing, that server can be DNS sinkholed so that it never resolves in the first place and simply fails to route to its end destination and goes nowhere. You know, but by utilizing hacks to the host file on your system, this could be very easily accomplished as well, at the end of the day. And so those protections that would enable them to retaliate against somebody for pirating are also potentially able to be blocked, if they are going down this packet injection route of hacking people's switches to disable it. you know So Nintendo was once again asserting rights that it doesn't appear to have, at least in America, as was pointed out to them. These Yulios are not necessarily enforceable. So there's a lot of questions that are you know left open by this article in particular, which is about the technicals of how and the means that Nintendo would use to, detect such activity and kill a console. And if they are going down the route that one could be forgiven for, suspecting that they were to go down and using packet injection to get this done, Well, there are a lot of potential pitfalls to actually going down a packet injection route. To anybody who really knows their shit, because as I said, if they go down a packet injection route and that packet were to be captured, again, the security posture of all too many of these companies is, to not do anything about a security vulnerability until somebody actually is actively exploiting it. And then once they're doing that and after the fact, they go into damage control mode. But, there's so many concerns with this, because it's like, if they're building it in a naive fashion when they build it without an access control list that prevents any willy-nilly IP address from doing this, well, Nintendo has just opened itself up to a class action lawsuit when, malicious actors start exploiting those packets in order to deny people access to their consoles by causing them to brick themselves. If they do build in security controls so that only accepted IP addresses can do this, this is not bulletproof security, because Nintendo's a big company and it only takes one employee fucking up and downloading the wrong attachment and running the wrong, uh, macro in Office or whatever means you want to use to get it done, and, you know, telling Office to run the script, as so many people on Windows just automatically and unthinkingly do at the end of the day. And, one wrong move in that space, and the hacker has built, a proxy and that will be flagged with the right flags by people switches, and again can just, snarf, or as in, send that packet through a SOX 5 proxy right on to the, person's switch, and then again they piggyback off Nintendo's server. So they've punched a hole at that point in the access control list by rerouting their packets through, a proxy that they've hacked into Nintendo with by utilizing spear phishing attacks. So, you know, and you might be saying, well, if they do that, we can send on those data packets to the abuse department at their ISP. But, again, that problem is circumvented with the use of something like OVPN, which doesn't keep logs on file, in the long run and for the long term. you know so if they were, in theory, to turn people's system into an expensive paperweight, well, the only way to do this, you know, would be with packet injection. Otherwise, all they're really doing is terminating somebody's account services, which means that all they're really doing is preventing people from utilizing their Switch to engage in online play, do things like share achievements with other people and everything else. And, it only really matters if you care about that. Otherwise, who gives a fuck? You know, if you're like me and you only like a certain style of game, as I do, then, none of that really matters. And, as I said, the Intel employees were a little bit incredulous and were like, you're probably misinterpreting this, and that they're probably just going to close out people's account services and everything. And I was like, I agree with you, but if, there still is a potential here that when they say this, they really mean that they are threatening to turn people's devices into a expensive paperweight. And if they are going to do that, there's only one way to go about doing that, because if I lose account services, that's one thing. My Switch is now partially unusable, but, you're talking about disabling features that I don't personally have a reason to give a shit about. I don't. I really don't. I mean, I only like, single player turn based RPGs and maybe the occasional MMO, where combat, isn't as action intensive as it may be in other systems. So, when when they talk about all this, when it talks about the potential implications here for, there are a number of things and avenues to worry about and consider when it comes to this. If, as one could be led to suspect by such a Yulia, you know, that they really, when they say these things, they really mean they are threatening to brick people's systems. Again, as I said, there's only one way to get that achieved, which is to go down the packet injection route. But again, that's a path that is fraught with pitfall after pitfall. I mean, as we've already gone over, as I've already said in summary, if it is a packet injection route they're going down, then you have, as I see it, problems from multiple angles. It's a little bit like, you know, trying to, putting the bank vault in, the bank robber's house with the police not informed of the fact that he's, that you've done this at all, and he can use whatever tools he wants to attack this system and find the Easter egg in the system and then go share it with whoever he wants. But so if that's the case and you build it in with a security approach, those, again, that IP address is going to leak to the broader web at some point, and at that point building firewall rules then to block those packets is a trivial matter for those who know what they're doing. And if it tells it to connect to some remote server that downloads the bricked firmware, then again, one can build in a DNS sinkhole to block that from going through in the first place. And so all attempts to go to that domain just end up timing out and going nowhere. So as I said, there are many potential pitfalls to doing this, and the final problem is if they do what so many corporations have done, if it is as lazy as has been done by so many corporations in the past, if it matches the experience that I have had with companies, like the time that I essentially put a hackerware modem online, and the only security that I was to find to prevent a modem from coming online on Time Warner's network back in 2008 or so was that the only security that was in place was the use of a false DNS server, which was poisoned to hell and beyond, and had used DNS poisoning to prevent people from getting from accessing the web on an unprovisioned modem. But as I discovered, an unprovisioned is just a modem that hasn't been paid for or is not recognized by the company. But as I discovered, through my hacking efforts in that period, the only thing that one had to do was to find a different DNS server and use that instead, and you could get pretty decent speeds in those days on an unprovisioned modem, effectively circumventing the only real security that was in place on their network at Bright House at that time. This was just a massive hole in security that was able to be exploited by anybody who knew this particular problem existed in the first place. And it was plainly ridiculous to me that this was the only security that was in place at all, and nobody thought to do anything about the problem until it was actively being exploited by many, many, many people. Security was not updated for a very, very long time, which again highlights the problem that I'm talking about here, which is that corporations have a lengthy history of only actually patching a security vulnerability after it's being exploited actively in the wild. And if, as one could be led to suspect by such articles, they are in fact doing the unlikely and going down the packet injection route. Again, as I said, there are massive, glaring problems with that. So many. Again, in summary, if they're damned if they do and damned if they don't, in the sense that if they were to build security into it, then that list of IP addresses that have been whitelisted will leak at some point, and people can engineer in rules that ignore packets coming from those IP addresses into their firewall. If they do, and if they don't, then they've just handed every script kiddie who is smart enough to trick ChatGPT into writing the Python script to use that packet, and to brick other people's systems and engage in a denial of service, you know, uh, exploit that uses the ability to harness that same packet and replay attack people's systems. I mean, that's what it would be. You capture the packet that does it, and then you replay it at an innocent victim.